Welcome back into the Lions 24/7 podcast. I am Tyler Donahue. Welcome into February 2025. We finished off January by having Josh Pate join us. If you missed that one, it dropped last Thursday. A national commentator with 24/7 Sports and CBS spent 30 minutes on with us reviewing a really busy January for Penn State football in terms of roster retention and bringing in defensive coordinator Jim Knowles from the Ohio State Buckeyes, how that has kind of recalibrated the outlook for the Nittany Lions. Backtrack to our last episode if you missed it. We got a lot to talk about with Jim Knowles on this episode because we are relatively fresh out of his debut press conference here in Happy Valley. We're still working through our press conference set situations over at Pagula, the hockey home, while Penn State undergoes its renovations. And that's where we were this Tuesday afternoon alongside Daniel Gallant and Mark Brennan, who joined me here on the Lions 24/7 podcast. A couple of weeks since we heard from Daniel and Mark. They've been on the basketball scene quite a bit lately, but we're all regrouped, got back into football mode here on Tuesday. And Mark, we've seen a few of these defensive coordinator introduction press conferences under James Franklin, Manny Diaz just a few years ago, Tom Allen just last winter. This one, though, strikes a different feeling when you consider what they gave him financially and where they brought him from. And, oh, by the way, 2 weeks ago, he's fresh off a national championship with the Ohio State Buckeyes. Today, he's wearing a Penn State logo here in State College.
Yeah, just setting the scene a little bit. It was kind of crazy because he was literally meeting the sports information or athletic communications, whatever they call themselves now, people before that press conference. And what a difference from Tom Allen and just in the way he carries himself. And I'm not saying that as a negative toward Tom Allen, but Tom Allen, I wasn't even joking. I mean, to transcribe Tom Allen's stuff, we literally had to slow it down and then stick it into this program called Otter. He talks a mile a minute. Jim Knowles literally scratching his chin, thinking through every question, every answer measured, showed some flashes of a sense of humor, but you could tell that this was a very serious man. And I don't mean this as anything negative toward Tom Allen because he got things done the way he got it done. But just a stark difference in what we've seen. And then obviously a stark difference from Andy Kotelnicki as well, because he's just such an outgoing, I don't want to say bombastic, that may be a little bit overboard, but you look at this guy and you could tell there's a level of seriousness about him. And I think we heard it from our Ohio State people, kind of what he's all about. I know you talked to Patrick. I had a chance to talk to Steve Hellwagon, and just very direct, very measured, and the way he carries himself. There's something, I don't want to say intimidating, but it's like, wow, you could kind of tell that guy knows what the heck he's doing. And then the things that he had to say, I think that's more important probably than the way he carried himself, but I just wanted people to know. And we have the whole video up on our Lions Pride board if you want to actually go see the video. But, I thought when Neil Riddell asked him about does he still aspire to be a head coach? And, he basically said no. What he wants to do is help Penn State win a national title at the point of the career that he's in. He followed up on it a little bit later. At the point of his career that he's in, he threw out a little bone for Daniel Gallant, saying at one point you may be, dreaming of being the head coach of the Green Bay Packers. That kind of dates him a little bit too, right? Because, I don't know who would be dreaming of being the coach of the Green Bay Packers now. But just, kind of the way that I think after Penn State seeing this rotating door of defensive coordinators the last few years, and offensive coordinators for that matter, to hear somebody talk about that, their goal is to help Penn State win a national title. And that sounded earnest to me. I mean, that sounded like it was genuine. That did not sound like coach speak to me. So he doesn't really carry himself like a head coach. And I think that's actually a good thing for Penn State, because I think it'll probably mean he ends up staying here a little bit longer, if not very long. And I'm sure all those, figures after the dollar sign will help him decide to stay as well.
Yeah. By the way, the contract details that were reported by CBS Sports, we got to see those late last week. Had a story up at Lions 24/7 breaking that down. You're talking about a base annual salary for the next 3 seasons of north of $3 million. Last year, the highest paid coordinator in college football was around $2.5 million. And when you factor in some of the bonus incentives, where if Penn State were to achieve all their goals, win a national championship, win a Big Ten championship, he could actually end up with more than $4 million in an annual salary. We're talking about a coordinator here, not a head coach, although he does have head coaching experience at Cornell, which is his alma mater. But he's been around, Daniel, as a defensive coordinator, a lot of success for a long time at Duke. Then he goes over to Oklahoma State, and I think people think Oklahoma State in modern football, they think of the high-powered down the field offense, but he had a really remarkable run there that leads him to being poached away by Ohio State. Year 3, he wins a national title. As he pointed out to us a couple times in the press conference today, they had the number 1 ranked defense in the country in Columbus last year. And so you're bringing a guy in he's got goals. He's talking about him. But again, 2 weeks ago, he finished off a campaign where he did have the number 1 scoring defense, total defense in America. They won the national championship. And so, as he said for Franklin, there's a lot of proof available of what Penn State has done over the years on defense. Well, we've got all the proof you need that Jim Knowles is a bona fide star in the coaching world. And again, this just hits differently when you bring in a guy like this, put him in front of a podium. He's not next to James Franklin. He's speaking on his own. And this is one that I think Franklin can really wear with a lot of pride, because he's told us that was the communication. It was James Franklin. It was Jim Knowles. It felt like Pat Kraft was in the background according to Knowles, but this is a Franklin special. So marry those two things, Daniel, the home run pickup here and also what James Franklin was able to accomplish behind the scenes and getting it done.
Yeah, I think that one of the, talking points that's come out since this was made like 2 weeks ago or a week ago is that people are like, well, the defense wasn't the problem last year. Why are you spending all of this money on the defense? Why are you making this investment in the defense? And I think that if you're Penn State, you have to keep your defense at a high level. We've seen some of these offenses that are in the college football playoff and what you can do. I mean, you have to stay at a high level, and if you're Penn State, if you're James Franklin, you want to get the best. If you want to beat the best, if you want to be the best, you have to have the best on your staff. And I think that there's a not insignificant segment of the college football world, college football media that probably views Jim Knowles in that light. And so, and I think also we've talked about it before where, this was a statement move by Penn State, by James Franklin to, signal, their intentions for this upcoming season. And I think what Knowles talked about and the tone that he set really plays into what the goal is for Penn State now. It is to win national championships. And, it's nice that, we're at the time of year where, Nevada on August 30th is pretty far away. So you can't quite go into 1-0 mode right now. So to hear the overarching mindset from Jim Knowles was, I think, really interesting and some good insight into him as a competitive person, in terms of what Mark was saying about how Knowles carries himself. I believe it was over on Bucknuts where it was written that, Knowles is someone who, would like to be in his office with a cigar, going over tape, designing defenses. And that was something that struck me too, about how he was carrying himself, how he was talking about things. And so, I think that Penn State has found itself someone who wants to be here, someone who wants to have success here, and someone who wants to make things happen here. And I think that is really, really big for James Franklin.
Mark, one thing I wanted to circle back on it, because you actually asked the question of Pat Kraft and his role in all this. And as I just brought up, we heard from Knowles that it was a lot of dialogue with James Franklin, with the seeming presence of Pat Kraft in the background. And the way he described this was that while everyone was incredibly supportive and welcoming when he got to campus, he said with James Franklin, didn't have much contact with Pat Kraft, really went through the head coach there. And he says, quote, it always just came through that Coach Franklin has tremendous support from the AD, from the president. You felt the alignment in the conversations that I had. So again, not a lot of direct conversation with Pat Kraft, but I wanted to ask you, Mark, are you buying that? I mean, do you think that the dollar signs do what they do? They move mountains, they convince people to take jobs. But when you talk about that alignment, this is echoing James Franklin.
Right.
It feels like James Franklin almost wrote down this part for him and said, why don't you read this aloud? But I mean, if he's saying it, James Franklin's clearly expressing he feels that way. you've covered a lot of different administrations across your time with Penn State, and ones that not just James Franklin had to deal with, past coach. Yeah. And there's been highs and lows. And so now that we have some tangible evidence that they can sign this kind of a check, they can bring this kind of a guy to town. And he's saying it wasn't Pat Kraft selling it to me. It was James Franklin. And it wasn't much of a pitch. It was just saying, here's how I can fit in. Are you buying that Penn State has really pulled up a seat at the big boy table? And I mean the biggest of boys in college football in terms of how they intend to operate now and moving forward.
Yeah, I mean, was it Pat McAfee last week who he had to clip? And I think Pat McAfee's really good, by the way. But he used the visual of that press box coming down. It's like, hey, Penn State's all in. They're going to spend what they need to spend. And I know that spending was done before some of that spending was done before this happened. But I thought that was a great visual in that, Penn State's going to be willing to spend what it has to spend. And that's so antithetical to the way that it used to be. But I think it's the way that it has to be anymore when you're basically in an arms race against everybody else. This $3 million is going to be the high coordinator level for a year, maybe. Somebody else is going to. This is setting the table for other coordinators to make more. And when you're going to have this $20 million pool or whatever it is to be throwing at athletes, you're going to have to spend that kind of money because you're making that kind of money. I mean, they're making crazy money, and it's only going to get even crazier the more the haves get separated from the have-nots. But to answer your question directly, Tyler, which I know I'm kind of going around in circles, I was laughing because he was using the very terms that Franklin uses. He might as well have gotten in the bus and backed it over Sandy Barber a couple times, while the way that Franklin has done every single time that he's praised Pat Kraft. But I mean, and he's praising Pat, rightfully so. I think the interesting thing about that dynamic is that we weren't quite sure how involved Kraft was, but to me, this says that Kraft had the trust in Franklin to go after the person that he wanted most, and hey, we're going to have your back, whatever it takes at a reasonable level. And we've heard Franklin say it over and over and over again the last year or so about the alignment between the AD, the board of trustees, at least most of the people on the board of trustees, some obvious exceptions, and Ben DePuty, the president, and that alignment is going to allow them to get to where they need to be. So they got within spitting distance this year. Now there's no more excuses. You have the highest paid coordinator out there. You have another highly paid, highly sought after coordinator. You have all this alignment that you're talking about. You got to the Final Four this year. Now there's no more excuses.
I think, Mark just sent us a text a few minutes ago, and this was kind of my answer to it. I didn't necessarily know that we were going to go this route, but under the radar kind of notes from this press conference, that would probably have been mine. The fact that he's hearing the same message from James Franklin on those personal calls when you're in the pressure cooker trying to deal with something, trying to deal with that kind of money and that kind of a scenario. If he's giving the same message to Jim Knowles that he's giving us in the press conference, I'm increasingly convinced that he is convinced that's the case himself. And so, Daniel, when we kind of look beyond the obvious headline, maybe items of this press conference, and we have the full thing over at Lions247.com, including a breakdown and a story that you wrote about some particular motivation to come to Penn State. Do you think there's anything that overall, when people talk about this, maybe won't get enough attention, but piqued your interest enough to bring up here on the podcast?
I think it'll get some attention when you write about it, Tyler, but I thought his feedback on the jack position was interesting because that was something where what we were hearing from Columbus, and for background, the jack position is something that he used at Duke and Oklahoma State, where it was, I think, kind of like a hybrid defensive end linebacker. Mm-hmm. The way that he described it today was someone that was just you could find them. They might not fit the stereotypical physical requirements for linebacker or defensive end, but they're just a good football player. And Tyler, and that was something at Ohio State we heard that never really materialized. People were waiting to see it, and it just never sort of happened. And there's a lot of reporting on the dynamics that were involved there. But I thought, Tyler, it was interesting when you asked him about it today that he was really non-committal about it, and he said that we need to see what we have here. We need to see. I need to get to know these players, see what they do well, see if we have anyone who really fits that. I thought that was kind of not painting yourself into a box when you come in. I think that's always smart for any of these introductory news conferences. And I think it also shows where that Knowles knows that this is a little bit of a different situation that he's walking into. It was the second question that I wanted to ask. I went somewhere a little differently, but he had those comments about, I think when he took over Ohio State, how it was a 2 to 3 year process. Coming from Duke and Oklahoma State, those are two programs that don't have the same resources in terms of talent and support as a Penn State does, and so that alters your approach a little bit. And I think one thing we heard was that he might be a little rigid sometimes in how things go. And so I think that today we saw and heard potentially a willingness to be flexible, someone who knows that he's walking into an area that already has a lot of infrastructure, a lot of people and resources that he can rely on and go from there. So I think that might be a small thing, like one position on the field, but I think the way that Knowles approached that question and laid things out, I think that speaks to the larger environment that he's walking into.
And it was a really important position for his defense prior to his time in Columbus. When you look at Duke, Oklahoma State, certainly, and even back to Central Michigan, Eagles fans probably remember Jason Babin. He was the original, I think he called it a Leo back then. It was the Jack at Ohio State, but it also wasn't very commonly utilized at Ohio State. That's something that Patrick Murphy, who covers the Buckeyes for 24/7 Sports, when he joined us last week, said it was always each offseason they'd kind of generate some discussion about what the Jack spot's going to look like, who's going to fill it. And then it really wouldn't be that much part of the process on a game-to-game, week-to-week basis for this defense. Ultimately, I think what stood out to me a little bit as well, Mark, and it was regarding that position, but regarding overall defensive philosophy. Now, Jim Knowles said he's learning that he's got to make sure he's studying what Penn State has done in the past, just as they're going to study what he has done in the past, because it's going to be a meshing. He gave a big tip of the cap to James Franklin and said it hasn't just been one coordinator with success at Penn State. They've had a few different guys, and you go back behind before James Franklin. I know there's a lot of stuff that has been gone down on the defensive side of the ball that people are proud of here at Penn State, but James Franklin has specifically noted to us several times that he thinks that there is a culture in place that a coordinator can come into, and then they become a part of that. And so when you figure that Jim Knowles obviously has a lot of his own ideas, but he's got Anthony Poindexter, Terry Smith, Deion Barnes, Dan Connor, guys who were with this program last year, been with the program in years past. Mark, he talked about embracing them, having those voices in the room. He said it makes his life a lot easier. One of the complications we heard from his time with Ohio State was maybe that synergy didn't exist the way it needed to among that defensive staff, the way Ryan Day handled it. We've heard about Larry Johnson and him maybe stepping on each other's toes a little bit in that defensive room. What do you make of adding a personality and a mastermind like Jim Knowles, but also saying, here are your defensive assistants. We have a lot of faith in them. And here is our history. We have a lot of faith in that too. Let's mesh.
Yeah, well, that actually dovetails into what I was going to say, the kind of under the radar thing. And you threw it out there. He mentions, shout out to those assistants, Deion, Dex, Terry, Dan. Dan Connor, I mean, he's listed as being defensive analyst and analytics coordinator. Now, anybody who's been around the team knows that I don't know what he's analyzing or what he's coordinating, but he sure looked a lot like he was coaching linebackers last year, didn't he? He sure looked a lot. And with those rules, with the way the rules are now, and that's one thing that I think when we get an opportunity to talk to James Franklin next week, I don't know. I haven't heard it. I don't know if you guys did. Maybe I missed it somewhere along the way, but will he have a position group that he's focusing on, or is he going to be a more all-encompassing coordinator the way Kotelnicki is, right? But I think the fact that he's throwing Dan Connor in number one, it goes back to what you were saying, Tyler, not just Dan, but obviously when you have Terry Smith, who's been with Franklin from day one here, Dex has been around forever now, and Deion Barnes, even before he was an assistant coach, he was a guy who was a GA and had whatever other titles that they were giving people to try to keep them on the staff. I think that's important. because now you have to get to know all these players. And imagine what a challenge that is. I mean, he was probably scouting Penn State last year, but not the defensive players. I mean, he probably knows more about the offensive players than he does about the defensive players. So having that group, and especially Terry Smith and Dex, who I think have been invaluable to James over these last, however many years, I think that's just really key. But when he said Dan Connor, it made me think, yeah, it almost sounds like he's going to be more of the overseer coach as opposed to the prototypical, the way we've seen it for years and years. And maybe this is just the way things are going now, that they could have larger coaching staffs. But I think it bodes well, because Dan Connor, everything we heard from Kobe King last year, that when Dan Connor took over as the guy in the headset, talking to Kobe King out on the field, now you have a guy who was an All-American at Penn State. Now you have a guy in calling plays out there among some other really good linebackers. Now you have a guy who was with the Dallas Cowboys, even though I hate the Cowboys, but he was out there in the NFL calling plays for NFL teams in the games. That's the guy who's calling your defense. So I think those things bode really well. And the fact that he went out of his way to say that, and I'm paraphrasing, that he's probably doing as much listening as he's doing talking right now. And I think that's important, especially given the guys that you have coming back.
Yeah, and again, we'll get to that now. It is a cupboard that is pretty well stocked in terms of what Jim Knowles is walking to here in State College. You lose your middle linebacker, the guy you just referenced in Kobe King. He was the disseminator of the coaching staff's message during the game. He was a team captain. He was your most consistent linebacker. That's a loss. You lose the best defensive player in this draft in Abdul Carter. Imagine the things that Jim Knowles may have been able to accomplish with him. But he's moving on to the NFL. And also Jalen Reed, KJ Winston, who we only got to see for a couple games this year. But Daniel, something I challenged you and Mark to come up with here for this particular podcast as we assess what Jim Knowles has at his disposal, preparing for spring practices, defensive players who entered this offseason with momentum. And we'll learn a little bit about that jack position in the weeks ahead. By the way, Tyler Calvaruso has a story up on that, spotlighting some younger players on this roster who might be able to fill it. I'll have a story this week on some of Jim Knowles' commentary and how this position could fit the defense. But putting that in its own little category for now, Daniel, go any position you want. Who is a player or two that you think defensively came out of that playoff run and had a lot of wind in their sails?
I think you start on the back end with Zachy Wheatley. I thought that he kind of kicked things off by announcing his return. I believe after I think that was after the first round game, but before the Fiesta Bowl.
One of those games.
It all runs together. He says that he's coming back and then puts together a couple strong performances. I think that the one thing that it's kind of a cliche when we talk about defenders, and I probably lean on it a little too much, is that there are some times where you didn't really notice him back there. And I think that in terms of someone in the secondary who can be exposed, I think that that's a positive. And so, yeah, I think, when you talk about losing KJ Winston, losing Jalen Reed, you do get King Mack back. Dejon Lane got some valuable experience this year. There's still young guys who have not played a ton of football. And so to have a fifth-year senior on your back end of your defense who is the takeaway king, can make some things happen. And had a very good year last year when he was thrust into a bigger role. I think that's a really good building block for this defense moving forward.
Yeah, I absolutely agree with you on the Zachy Wheatley mention. Mark, where do you go on this one?
Yeah, I think the next obvious one is Denai Dennis Sutton. I mean, to me, he obviously benefited from being on the opposite side of Abdul Carter, which anybody's going to do, but he was just a total disruptor late in the year, and especially as they got into the postseason. And when he decided to come back, you hate to lose a guy like Abdul Carter, but if he has a chance of going number one overall, you completely understand why he's doing it. But I think this brings just a whole different level of stability to the defensive line that you would not have had he decided to go out. I firmly believe that whenever he goes out, he's going to be pushing to be a first-round draft pick. I don't know that it necessarily would have happened this year, but he would have gone to the combine and done extremely, extremely well. And so I think being able to get him back after the way he kind of just took off, and I think was the dominant player a lot of us figured he was going to be all along during that stretch run in the playoffs. So Denai Dennis Sutton is my guy.
Mark, that's where I was going to go, and I believe the number was 4 sacks, 6 tackles for loss during the postseason. I mean, he was really impressive, and I just want to mention this because we were all in separate locations in post game down in South Florida after the Orange Bowl, and it was emotional wherever you want. But I got a chance to stand alongside Dennis Sutton for a little while, just the two of us there, and he had tears in his eyes, and they were coming down his cheeks, but he was speaking so directly and so straightforward. And when I brought up the Drew Aller, and the possibility of him getting blamed for this loss, he was so effusive in his defense of his quarterback and kind of just saying it's a team game. I got the sense then that this guy was so bought in the locker room, it's going to be hard for him to walk away on that note. But I still considered that playoff success, his 5-star pedigree, what he would do in a combine setting. It was all there on the table for him. So big to come back. I'm going to go to the linebacker.
Can I say one thing about Denai? After the game, I owe him an apology because he said after the game, something about, I think I just may have played that was my last game. And then he said with some teammates, and I missed some teammates. So I said, did you say that was your last game? And he was really emotional. I didn't hear exactly what he said. So I kind of pushed him on it a little bit while he was emotional. And then I go back and listen to it. He very calmly and politely explained what he meant about it with some of his teammates, and that's why he was emotional. But next time I see him, I'm going to have to say, hey, I misread what you said. But sometimes you're in those post-game scrums, and it's very difficult. There's stuff going around. But anybody who heard that he was pressed on that a little bit, that was me, and that was me making a mistake. So I owe him an apology about that.
Appreciate that, Mark. And I'm just going to bounce over to linebacker now. We got the secondary cover, the defensive line. I think Tony Rojas showed flashes of what he can be and maybe where he's at during the postseason in a way we didn't see during the regular season. And in fact, there were conversations on this podcast once we got into November about maybe was Rojas a bit of a weak link for this defense overall. I think he was playing on ice skates or roller skates, whatever you want to call it out there at times during his sophomore season as a first-year starter. Didn't look all that comfortable, some of the angles of pursuit that he took. But in the postseason, I mean, look, all the confidence in the world coming out of that SMU game. You're sitting in the stands after a touchdown, ball in your hands. That's good stuff. And I thought he really built on that against Boise State, which was a very different opportunity to showcase for him. He had some nice plays in pass defense against SMU. Against Boise State, he had a career high with 5 solo tackles. I thought he answered the bell for a defense that knew they collectively and individually needed to corral the running back, Ashton Genty, in that situation. Didn't have a noisy game against Notre Dame, but I just felt like throughout the regular season, a lot of times we noticed him, guys, was because it was a lapse. And I didn't notice him because of that in the playoffs. I noticed him because he was making good things happen. And so that's where I land. I'm going to throw one more name out there. And if anyone else wants to toss another non-starter for me, Davian Collins. We heard so much about him during the offseason last year. Coming out of spring ball, we had cornerbacks coach Terry Smith saying he was the most improved cornerback. He might have had the best spring practice. And heard good things in preseason, but the first couple months of the year, he was like the 5th or 6th cornerback. Was not involved very much. Might get out there for 10, 12 snaps on occasion. Then things changed. Elliot Washington got banged up in November. He wasn't available for some time, and that really served a launch pad for Davian Collins. I thought that sustained into the playoffs, even with Elliot Washington back. And now Cam Miller's with the Rutgers Scarlet Knights. Now you've got Jalen Kimber preparing for the NFL draft, and you start to work your way through that cornerback group. I think it was a big deal that he showed some validation, and for himself, and for those of us who have heard about it, for all the offseason buzz last year, I think we started to understand why that was the case when we got into November, December, and into January even a little bit. So I'd say tip of the cap to Davian Collins for what he was able to do at the end of his redshirt sophomore year, a guy who transferred in from Mississippi State in 2023. Any other names to throw out there, guys?
I think if you're looking, beyond the playoff and maybe the season in total going in the next year, I think you have to put Zane Durant in the category where just the body of work that he had over the course of his junior season. When you look forward into his senior season in 2025, he's going to be someone that isn't going to surprise people. He's going to be, I know Mike Rhodes likes to use the line top of the scouting report when referring to players and their value. And I think that going into next year, Zane Durant is going to be one of those top of the scouting report players based on what he showed. And I think what we believe that he's capable of. And so I think overall what he showed as a junior, I think you spin it forward to his senior season and you're looking at someone who can be a really, really big impact player for you.
You know what? I now I have to apologize again. At the return to rec game, we ended up not running a photo gallery because we didn't think people would want to see Penn State hoops getting blown out by 29 or whatever it was, or 19 in a game it probably should have won. But Daniel pointed this out to me, and the intern did as well, that Rojas was there in the stands with his right arm. Daniel, I think.
I believe it was right arm.
Yeah, his right arm in a sling, indicating that he had some sort of procedure. So that thing was like wrapped up the entire season, and we were wondering what impact that might have had. But it calls to mind last year at this time when we saw Drew Shelton slinged up, and he was ultimately fine for the season. So hopefully, we say this with all injured players, for Tony Rojas's sake, he is going to be all right. But that'll be good to get an update from James Franklin. And then we could never mention a Davian Collins on this show again without bringing up his nickname, the Squirrel. Okay. He's got the greatest nickname on the team, I think. And so it's got to be a Davian Collins first reference, Squirrel second, third.
Well, Squirrel and company will be back on the practice field next month, late March, and that's when Jim Knowles will really be able to get a good look at what he's got working on the field. Between now and then, a lot going on in team facilities. As you mentioned earlier, Mark, we're going to get a chance to hear from James Franklin next week. So we'll be back on the Lions 24/7 podcast with more coming out of that next Tuesday.
Young
and
players,
we'll
too.
Yeah, and we're going to get a bunch of second-year players. The freshman class from 2024 has been a great tradition annually now for Penn State the last few winters, where they kind of bring those guys up. We don't get a chance to talk to true freshmen with media during the season, so it's kind of like their on-campus debut. A bunch of them we got familiar with in high school, but that'll be fun. We will have another episode, though, between now and then. Later this week, we'll get Tyler Calvaruso back on board. There's a lot going on with recruiting. We'll see what else we can come up with in terms of conversation, but for now, we're going to step aside. Really encouraging everyone to check out the Jim Knowles coverage over at Lions247.com from his debut press conference. Get the entire video, get our Q&A breakdown, and Daniel has kind of a angle on the story of why exactly Jim Knowles saw a fit for himself and sees Penn State as a place that's on the brink of a championship, and he might be the guy to help get them there. Daniel, Mark, it's been a couple weeks since we heard from you on the podcast. I hope the football offseason has treated you well so far, and we're back at it now with a little conversation post-Knowles. Appreciate it, guys.
Thanks,
We moved
Tyler.
to further action in the third period.
That's a Jim Knowles joke. Got to check out the video to get that one. Thanks, fellas. On behalf of Daniel Gallen, Mark Brennan, our entire crew at Lions247.com, I am Tyler Donahue. This has been the Lions 24/7 podcast.